Hi everybody, I'm Dr. Josh Redstone and I'm back with my final full video lecture for my class Philosophy 2501A, Introduction to Philosophy of Mind. Today what I thought I would do is pick up from where we left off last time with our discussion of artificial minds or artificial intelligence and talk a little bit about artificial consciousness, the difference between AI on the one hand and artificial consciousness on the other, and how it might be possible to know or come to know whether a machine is conscious. So, probably what I'll do is try to keep it fairly light today. It is the last lecture and I know that I'm quite behind schedule with these lectures, so we'll start with a quick recap of what we discussed last time. And then I'll talk a little bit about how different schools of thought would approach the notion of artificial consciousness. Of course, before I get to that, I'll probably talk just a little bit about the distinction between artificial consciousness and artificial intelligence. And then we'll move on to the more epistemological stuff. How could we know if a machine were conscious? How could we know that? How could we know if it were really conscious? So, with that said, let's get started with a quick recap. So last time I discussed the theory of computation, which basically says that computation is just information processing, rule-governed information processing. And we talked a little bit about the computational representational theory of mind, which basically says that cognition is computation. So computation is what computers do, it's also what minds do. And our minds are basically, if the computational representational theory of mind is true, our minds are like natural computers. And I discussed two different paradigms, if you like, physical symbol systems and artificial neural networks. Physical symbol systems work by transforming representations into other representations. So they process information by this rule-governed transformation of representations, moving from one representational state to another. Whereas artificial neural networks are modeled more, they're modeled after the way neural networks in the brain work. So they're inspired by things like neuronal firing patterns and Hebbian learning and all of that fun stuff. And they differ from physical symbol systems because their representations are not discrete or easily identifiable. We could call them subsymbolic or distributed representations. So those were the two paradigms we looked at, and in each case, just going back to the theory of computation for a little bit and the physical symbol system hypothesis, many of these thinkers feel that what intelligence amounts to, or what thinking amounts to, is intelligent problem solving. And we've created systems using each paradigm, each kind of mental architecture that can intelligently solve problems. We've got physical symbol systems that work as expert systems, for example. They can play chess, they might diagnose diseases, or we've talked briefly about similar neural networks that learn to do things, learn to do the kinds of things that human experts can do. I briefly mentioned the mine rock detector as an example of that. And all of this is stuff that I cover, of course, more in greater detail in my Introduction to Cognitive Science class, which I usually teach in the fall at Carleton University. But all this is to say is we can have AI, and AI does not necessarily imply consciousness, right? The mine rock detector can, for example, tell the difference between the sonar profiles of mines and rocks, but there's nothing that it's like to be the mine rock detector. And the same goes for any number of artificial cognitive systems that are symbolic in nature, and I'll try to remember to link some videos that will talk about some examples, perhaps Shaky the Robot, or the ID3 learning algorithm, or Eliza is a computer program we'll talk about today that was symbolic and seemed to be intelligent, at least in its heyday. So you can have artificial intelligence without something that it's like to be that system, right? Ned Block might put this in these terms, where an artificial intelligence could maybe be argued to have access consciousness. That is, representations are available for reasoning and planning and so forth, but many thinkers would be skeptical about these machines having phenomenal consciousness. That is, whether there is something that it's like to be this machine or this computer program or something like that. So that's the difference. We can have AI without artificial consciousness, without conscious experience. Of course, many might also argue that anything that was truly counted as an example of strong AI would be conscious. Some thinkers might argue that. I certainly don't. But in any case, let's leave this here. Let's say that there is this distinction between intelligent problem solving on the one hand and subjective experience on the other. And that would be the difference between a machine merely having artificial intelligence or artificial consciousness. So with that said, I think I'll move on and just briefly touch upon how some of the thinkers we've talked about so far in this class would approach the idea of artificial consciousness, and how some of the theoretical frameworks we've overviewed, such as global workspace theory or multiple drafts or dualism, or any number of theories that we've covered, what would those have to say about artificial consciousness? So let's talk about that now. So when it comes to how these various theoretical approaches that we've surveyed throughout this course would tackle artificial consciousness, or making a machine that was conscious, I think it's a good idea to start with dualism. And of course we can break this down along the lines of substance dualism, so thinkers like René Descartes, or more like a property dualism, like David Chalmers or something like that. Of course, with substance dualism, we're literally asking whether we can give a machine a soul. At least, you know, if we're talking about somebody like Descartes, a substance dualist like Descartes, who did think of human beings and animals as machines created by God, that were endowed with souls. Of course, animals just had appetitive souls and spirited souls. It was very much along the same lines of Plato, where humans had those two as well as a rational soul. So animals for Descartes were merely unfeeling automata, whereas humans had a rational soul, and that was what explained our consciousness, right? Of course, Descartes' not really talking about consciousness, he's talking about reason, and that's why it's very important, you know, not to sound like a broken record here, to keep this distinction between intelligence and consciousness straight, right? So when we talk about substance dualism and the prospect of artificial consciousness, we're right back to the dogma of the ghost in the machine in quite a literal sense, right? But if we talk about property dualism, well, then I think it's a question of whether we could give the machine sufficient information processing capabilities to realize consciousness within that machine. So if you're a property dualist, you probably think that consciousness depends upon informational properties rather than physical properties. So it's a question of whether we could make a machine, if AI is all about information processing, it's a question of whether we can make a machine that processes information in the right kind of way, or respects whatever properties are important, whatever informational properties are important to implement consciousness in that machine. But I won't say too much more about dualism because I'm not a dualist. I don't want to misrepresent dualism. So let's move on to physicalism briefly. The physicalism, of course, we've seen a variety of different theories. Global workspace theory, multiple drafts. These are a couple of physicalist theoretical frameworks. Of course, we've looked at a lot of particular thinkers too, and I'll link an interesting paper by Daniel Dennett that touches upon some of the questions that arise on a physicalist understanding of artificial minds and qualia and experience and all of those things. But I like to bring all of this back to the possibility of philosophical zombies when I think of this along the lines of physicalism. Now, for those who maybe don't remember, or for anyone who's watching who's not familiar, a philosophical zombie is something that is identical to you physically, but which doesn't have any conscious experience. So it's right down to the molecules, right down to the atoms. It's identical to you. It's a copy of you, but it has no conscious experience. All is dark inside, as David Chalmers says. And of course, the idea here is to ask yourself whether this is plausible or possible. If you think that it's possible to have something physically identical to you, but without any conscious experience, if zombies are possible or conceivable, then you're probably a dualist, right? But if you think that something that's physically identical to you and behaves exactly like you do must necessarily be conscious, then you're probably a physicalist, because you think that, well, if something's built the same way I am and its brain does the same things I do, mine does, and it behaves in the same ways, if I poke it and it says ouch, it must necessarily be conscious, because consciousness arises out of physical processes and not any kind of mysterious informational properties, or because of a soul or anything like that. So as a physicalist, I don't really think there's any barrier to creating artificial consciousness. I think that if I created some kind of molecule by molecule copy of myself, it would be conscious, because it would have a brain identical to mine, doing the exact things that my brain does, and I think it would be conscious. But of course, if it were conscious, how would we know, right? We're getting back to the very same problem we started the class with, the problem of subjectivity. I don't doubt for a second that you, my students, are conscious beings, but if you ask me to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt that other minds exist, well, how on earth would I do that? That's actually what I want to talk about for the remainder of this lecture. And I'm just going to kind of riff on some of these classic questions that, for me, keep me interested in this stuff. Now, before I get started, I want to say this is not to be overly self-indulgent or anything. This is my area of research: artificial minds, artificial consciousness. How would we know that an artificial mind was really intelligent? All of this fun stuff. This is what keeps me coming back to philosophy and cognitive science. And I think it would be a good kind of thing to focus on for the remainder of this lecture, because although these slides that I've put up, if you've already taken a look at them, seem a little bit dense, I'll be able to take you through a lot of this stuff faster than, I guess, the content of my slides indicate. So don't worry about this lecture being too heavy or dense. I think this would just be not only an informative thing to talk about, an informative question to talk about, but a fun question to talk about. If a machine were conscious, if a machine was purported to have artificial consciousness, how would we know? That's what I want to talk about now. Alright, so as some of you may have guessed, if we want to talk about other machines thinking, feeling, and so on and so forth, we've got to talk about the Turing Test. So that's where we're going to start. So Alan Turing, the computer scientist I discussed a little bit last time in my discussion of computation and the computational representational theory of mind, was also concerned with this tricky question: can machines think? And Turing himself thought that this question was too meaningless to deserve discussion, which we'll come back to in a minute, because when you really read some of Turing's other work, I think it's kind of surprising that he would say such a thing. In any case, this question, can machines think, we'll call this, following Stuart Schieber, the big question. To answer this question, Turing came up with something called the Imitation Game. Nowadays we call it the Turing Test, but Turing called it the Imitation Game. This is an operationalist test of intelligence. What that means is, if it's true, can machines think? Can machines think? Is that question too meaningless to deserve discussion? Well, maybe. If it is, if you don't want to get bogged down in the nuts and bolts of trying to define something, like intelligence or thinking or whatever. You can instead come up with an operationalist test of intelligence. What that involves is picking something that we all agree that intelligent entities can do, and then seeing if the thing we want to test for intelligence, in this case a computer, can do that thing. Of course, when it comes to computers, Turing thought we could distinguish thinking and non-thinking machines based upon their verbal behavior. So this, as we'll see, this is a very Cartesian understanding of intelligence. And before I get any further, I know I'm talking about intelligence right now, but I will bring this back to artificial consciousness as we continue to discuss the Turing test and all of this stuff. So, in the original version of the Imitation Game, there are 3 players. There's a man, a woman, and an interrogator. And the interrogator has to ask the man and woman questions. The interrogator can't see the man or the woman and communicates with them via teletype-written messages. And the man's job is to try to fool the interrogator into making the wrong guess, and the woman's job is to try to help the interrogator make the right guess. So the man might give misleading answers to the interrogator's questions, whereas the woman might give honest answers. So Turing asks in his paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, what will happen when a machine takes the place of A? Would the interrogator be able to tell the difference between the machine pretending to be a man and a man? In his later works, Turing simplifies this game where he just has 2 players. He just has a human or a machine being asked the questions and the interrogator who's asking the questions. And the interrogator has to ask in a kind of viva voce or living voice kind of thing. This is actually an old party game that people used to play. And if the interrogator cannot tell whether the player is a human or a machine, then Turing thinks we're justified in saying whatever the interrogator is asking questions to is thinking. So if it's a machine and the machine manages to answer in such a way that the interrogator cannot tell whether they're playing against a human or a machine, then we can justifiably say that machine can think. And some variant of this or another is usually how we talk about the Turing test nowadays. So Turing discusses this test in a number of different ways, which I think is really interesting. On the one hand, the Turing test is a thought experiment. And thought experiments are supposed to help us delineate our intuitions about something, to help get our concepts in order, to get our intuitions pumping, right, as Dan Dennett would say. That's what thought experiments were for. And Turing discusses this test as if it were a thought experiment. So, for example, he asks, are there imaginable digital computers which would do well at the Imitation Game? That's on page 442 of his article, In Mind, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. So is it conceivable that a digital computer suitably programmed could convince somebody that it is a human being and not a machine? So that's the thought experiment side of things. On the other hand, Turing also discusses it as if it's an actual empirical test. For example, he writes also on page 442 of his article, quote, "In about 50 years' time, it will be possible to program computers with storage capacity of about 10 to the 9th power to make them play the imitation game so well that an average interrogator will not have more than 70% chance of making the right identification after 5 minutes of questioning." So this is an obviously empirical version of the test, a test of whether a particular digital computer or perhaps a robot or whatever could think. So those are 2 approaches that we can take towards the Turing test. One is as a thought experiment and one is as an empirical test. And we can clarify these two perspectives by going back to what Turing thought was an intractably thorny question, whether machines can think or not. Can machines think? We'll try to do what Turing thought was pointless and define what we mean by machine and think. Turing in his original paper doesn't spend much time doing this at all, because he thinks it's a fruitless endeavor. But of course we can find clues in his other writings, and indeed we talked a lot about the theory of computation last time, where thinking is computation, and computation is the rule-governed transformation of representations. So seems to me that Turing had quite a clear idea in mind of what it means to think, even if he never really articulated computation, that computation is cognition himself. In any case, let's try to get some traction here. What is a machine? What is thinking? Well, a lot of people here point to Descartes as actually being one of the most important theoretical precursors to Turing's test. Indeed, in his Discourses on the Method, René Descartes wrote, I quote, "If there were machines bearing the image of our bodies and capable of imitating our actions as far as it is morally possible, there would still remain two most certain tests whereby to know that they were not therefore really men. Of these, the first is that they could never use words or other signs arranged in such a manner as is competent to us in order to declare our thoughts to others. The second test is that, although such machines might execute many things with equal or perhaps greater perfection than any of us, they would, without doubt, fail in certain others from which it could be discovered that they did not act from knowledge, but solely from the disposition of their organs." So there's two things Descartes thought we could use to tell whether something was really a thinking thing, a res cogitans. It could declare its thoughts to others using language, and it would give itself away in terms of what it could or could not do. Maybe a computer would be too fast if you asked it a mathematical question, and perhaps, I don't know, on the other hand, very bad at poetry. I don't know. I'm struggling to come up with some examples here now that we're at the end of the semester. But the two big essential differences that I see being talked about here are the ability to use language to declare our thoughts to others, and to be able to employ reason universally and not in an ostensibly deterministic or mechanistic way, the way that machines are seen to do. So Turing's Imitation Game is kind of like a game-theoretic version of Descartes' test. That's an argument we find in Stuart Cheever's excellent book on the Turing Test, which unfortunately I don't have a copy with me, but when you're able to get to the library next time, I encourage you to try to find this book at the local library. Anyway, so what is it to use reason? Well, we kind of talked about this before in our previous lecture, right? If you want to talk about a computationalist understanding of reason, what we're really talking about are moving from certain representational states to other representational states. These could be symbolic representations in a computer, or they could be propositional attitudes in a human being. Who knows? But this is the kind of thing, at least, that Turing seems to have in mind. Now, let's see, where do I want to pick this up from? So without getting into too many of the details, I've probably loaded the slides with way too many details here, so I'm trying to skip over a few things that I think are not strictly necessary, because we are running very short on time here. But so to summarize, without getting into too many of the gritty details here, I'll probably make another video about what thinking is for Turing, in case there's anybody interested after the class wraps up, or you just want to hear more about Turing tests and artificial minds and that kind of thing. I'll probably talk about that in more detail later, but it seems to me that the things that Turing must have thought were constitutive of thinking are the ability to use reason in a domain general way. So that is the ability to transform representations to other representations in a rule-governed way. To compute, to have cognition, to compute, is to use reason in a domain general way. And of course, the ability to express one's reasoning or conclusions of reasoning using language, and the ability to do this in a seemingly non-deterministic way, or with the appearance of freedom of the will. We may not have freedom of the will. We've talked about that in our in-person lectures, but it still seems to us like we do, and it seems in the course of our interactions with others that those whom we interact with are not robots, they're not determined, so we at least need this semblance, this of flexibility, or not being determined or constrained by your code or something, right? That's what I mean there. So I realize, once again, I've seemingly been talking mostly about thinking and about how we would know if a machine could think according to the Turing Test and so on and so forth. But I just want to reiterate that I think that Turing's operationalist understanding of intelligence, which of course you can trace back to Descartes' sort of verbal behavior test of intelligence, if you want to call it that, are also important for possibly testing whether a machine has consciousness, or if we had a hypothetical case where someone claimed to have created a machine with consciousness. I mean, really the only way that we could So I've been talking a lot about the idea of machine intelligence, yes, but I think that perhaps one of the ways we could come to know whether a machine was conscious is just having that machine report its experiences to us. So perhaps the only way of knowing for certain that that machines can perhaps think or experience things would be to use the same criterion that I use to determine that you think and feel things, and that is to listen and understand what you say, and also to see how you behave. So even though the Turing test was originally conceived of as a means of working out whether a machine could be said to think, we almost don't really need it for that purpose, right? If you're a computationalist, as you can see in the previous lecture, Turing laid the groundwork for understanding thinking as computation, and computation is what computers do, so computers can think, yes. Can they have qualia, or subjective experience? Well, the only way we could really know, or at least one of the ways that we might come to know, is by having a machine tell us. That is, of course, if you don't think the idea of something like a philosophical zombie is plausible, right? You could, if you're a dualist, you could easily just say, well, hang on, the machine's saying the right things, but how do I know that it's not all dark on the inside? So perhaps we can't use the Turing test that way. Perhaps it just depends on your theoretical or philosophical inclinations. And of course there are other theoretical problems with the test, as a test of intelligence, right? I mean, we see this, for example, in Searle's Chinese room thought experiment. And this is a thought experiment where we have somebody sitting in a room, and there are sheets of paper passed in and out of the room, right? And they have sentences written in Mandarin Chinese on them. Now the person in the room doesn't understand Chinese, but she has a rule book for manipulating the Chinese characters, and it allows her to look up the message that she's received, determine what the proper response is, and pass the response back outside. Of course, the people outside the room who are native speakers of Mandarin Chinese, well, they would think that whoever is in that room, machine or human, seems to understand Chinese and speak Mandarin fluently and all of that stuff. But the person in the room, Searle would argue, doesn't understand Chinese at all. They're just manipulating syntactic information, right? The symbols according to rules, but there's no actual understanding of what's going on there. So if Searle's right, there's no understanding going on in the Chinese room, and we could argue that there's no understanding going on, or at least we can't know that there's understanding going on from someone's verbal behavior in a Turing test. Of course, you may agree with this, you may not. It's a thought experiment, right? It's meant to get your intuitions pumping. So I'm not trying to tell you one way or another that the Turing test is a good way to tell if a machine is thinking or conscious, or that Searle's Chinese room thought experiment means that we can't know whether a machine in a Turing test or a person in a Chinese room really understands what they're doing. I'm not trying to sway you either way. I'm just trying to get you thinking about how we could come to know, or whether we could come to know these things. And of course there are various replies to the Chinese room thought experiment which could factor into the kind of thing I'm talking about here when it comes to machine consciousness. There's the systems reply, which says that maybe the person in the Chinese room doesn't understand Chinese, but the whole room, you know, the book, the person, all of this stuff all together as a system could be said to understand Chinese. There's also the robot reply. The room doesn't understand Chinese, but that's because it's embodied agents that understand Chinese, speakers of Chinese who go out and participate in this community of speakers speaking the same language and doing the same kinds of things with language, and that's where the understanding comes from. The understanding is, you know, comes from the pragmatics of being a speaker in a community that uses language a certain way. That's another reply. Of course, there are even further replies. Stephen Harnad points out something called the symbol grounding problem, for example, which is related to what Searle's trying to highlight with the Chinese room thought experiment. Symbols, you know, where do symbols get their meaning? We need a way to make the meaning in these symbols intrinsic to the symbols. And then Searle's worry about the person in the Chinese room having syntax but no semantics would be alleviated. And Harnad thinks this is possible because of the way that certain sensory and motor representations afford us a kind of understanding in the world. You know, we're embodied, we're in the world. We're not brains in vats, we're not people sitting in rooms receiving messages and passing out messages. We're active agents in a complex environment, right? And that's indeed another reply we could make to Searle, or another version we could do of a Turing test is Harnad's total Turing test, where we have an embodied agent undergoing the test. I'll link to some of these materials again because I'm trying to cover way too much here, and we're getting too short on time. All right, so what am I trying to say with all of this? Geez, never mind can machines think. I don't even know if it's apparent that I can think right now. This whole situation has left me a little winded and tired. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is that maybe we can't really know if a machine purported to be conscious was really conscious, right? We're still up against this problem of subjectivity that we talked about all the way back in the beginning of the class, right? What's it like to be a bat? What's it like to be a machine? Is there anything that it's like? How would we know? It seems to me one of the ways that we might know is if that machine told us that I feel pain, or I know what it's like to experience redness or blueness, or to feel the wind rushing over my skin, or to hear the birds chirping, or any number of things, right? Any number of experiences. But then we still have to contend with worries like those that are raised by the Chinese room thought experiment, or those that are raised by the conceivability of zombies. In short, I really don't know what the answer is here, but it's sure fun to think about. And I hope that even though this lecture has been kind of all over the place today, I really hope that I've given you something to think about, and if you find this kind of thing interesting, I will probably keep making videos about it. Videos where my thoughts are more ordered, um, when I'm not worried about trying to get lectures done, and the impending end of the semester, that's upon us, and all of that. So anyway, I hope I've left you with some things to think about. Perhaps if you're writing your essays on this topic, this has given you something to think about. Or if you just want to talk shop, send me an email. We can talk about thinking machines after we get through this semester. But for now, I think that's all I better say, because this lecture's been a little disorganized, and I'm feeling I'm really feeling the end of the semester right about now. So before I go, I want to say one quick thing, or a couple quick things. I will have something to say about your exam very shortly. I'll be making an announcement. Probably my announcement will be up before this video goes up, actually. But I'll make an announcement on See You Learn about the details of your exam, and I'll follow up with a quick video lecture on how I recommend you study for the exam. So, alright, I know the end of this class was not what we all had in mind when the semester started, but I think we're doing okay, considering the situation. I hope you're all still hanging in there. Thank you all for continuing to stay in touch with me. You've been asking me some great questions about the essay, about the exam, questions about the material. It seems like a lot of you are still engaged, so thank you for watching these lectures. Again, I'll have more to say about the final exam soon. So until then, take care, hang in there, stay safe, everybody.